Did you know that this 1990 top-down run and gun game from Capcom was actually an official sequel to 1985's classic Commando arcades game? It's true, of course many people for this game's release, especially those who didn't know about Mercs being a sequel, likely wouldn't have any reason to question it either. Let's face it, most kids picking up games back in the day would likely flip the box over and check out the gameplay screens rather than have a read. And for those who were too young to have known about Commando back in 1985, would have likely assumed that Mercs was just an awesome standalone game. As daft as it sounds, I also realised this whilst researching for this video. I used to play the Sega Mega Drive version of Mercs back in the mid-1990s, at which point it was likely that I had never heard of Commando. Remember, the internet, although was a thing for a minority audience, wasn't quite as mainstream like we have it today, and so information like this wasn't really easy to obtain. What makes Mercs even more intriguing is that even a European release of Mercs for the Sega Mega Drive doesn't mention being a sequel at all on its front or backside of packaging. So if, like me, you have just learnt this for the first time, welcome aboard. You have just spent the last 25 plus years of not realising this. But it is nice to finally do an arcade ports video in this series, which is actually an arcade sequel. It's fairly unlikely you would never heard of this game. It was released on many home computers during 1991 and released mainly by US Gold, with the notorious Tiratex developing these arcade conversions. Tiratex also developed the Sega Master System's version, although Sega released it as well as Sega developing and releasing the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis home conversion. Tiratex is notorious as they are infamously known for producing some of the worst games on these home computers at the time, a few of which I've already done in this series, such as the original Street Fighter game and most recently Rolling Thunder 2. So the game itself then, a fairly generic storyline. We are a mercenary who are aiming to rescue a former president from rebel forces set in the fictional African country of Zatula. We have a plenitude of weapons and upgrades within the game, and some of these are just awesome. We also have the ability to drive vehicles in this game too, such as jeeps. The original arcade game contains a total of 6 stages with a final boss stage. The arcade game actually allowed up to 3 players to play simultaneously. So today we are ranking from worst to best the computer and console conversions of 1990's Capcom arcade release of Mercs. Mercs ZX Spectrum style. So where do I start with this little Tiratex 8-bit micro version? I mean, it's a fact that a Spectrum game or any other 8-bit micro game could never get close to the greatness of the original arcade games. For many reasons, 8-bit computers were clearly way underpowered most of the time. But regardless of being underpowered, some of the Spectrum's versions of games have been fairly decent on and off. With the right coders who realised this limits and setbacks, was also realising that home conversions also needed to retain that element of being fun and challenging at the same time. Let's start with the graphics themselves. As you can see, by far, Mercs for the ZX Spectrum 128K models isn't nice to look at. It has far too much going on at the same time. The dotted grounds you can see are red. As we start the game from the shore of the beach, as we move upwards, those dashes and dots obviously represent the sand and mud. But as we move, the ground kind of feels or looks like it's moving with us and causes a little disorientation whilst playing. It is nice to see several colours being used for a ZX Spectrum game, but I am pretty confident that this would likely look much better just being in monochrome. Maybe a grey colour and black outlines for the scenery and characters. We have no introduction with this version, no helicopter sequence. We are just plopped onto the shore of the beach and make our way to the first boss, where suddenly music kicks in, and I must say it really isn't very impressive. I did actually notice with this version that enemies will constantly bombard you on the screen. They just don't give in at all. They chase you from behind mainly. The absolute terrible part of this version is the controls for vehicles. We don't have that 8-way diagonal movement here like the arcade game had, so moving jeeps looks very bizarre and it's by no means good to control. This version is just far too easy for its own good too. Now, Sinclair User issue 112 from June 1991 gave this game a 59% rating, mainly down to its ugly graphics. At this point, I had to remind myself that Tech developed these 8-bit computer versions, so where do I start here? I mean, there is so much wrong with this Commodore 64 release that I am thinking I can only say so much to make a video under 15 minutes for Mercs. Well, firstly, take a look at the scrolling. As we move through the game, the screen scrolls, but it scrolls in a way that it doesn't feel natural at all. It is just all over the place. Secondly, we have bizarre music being played as we play this game, which doesn't resemble Mercs at all, and it's not particularly a great tune either. The SID chip could do much better than this. Thirdly, moving the sprite also feels far too fast for its own good, and shooting enemies doesn't particularly feel rewarding, and there's also hit collision detection issues here. We make it to the end of each stage to confront a boss. With this Commodore 64 version, as we approach boss sections, the screen goes dark for a couple of seconds, and then the boss arrives, which just seems very unnatural and not very fluid. I make it to stage 2, and although the Jeep doesn't seem as bad to control as the Spectrum's version, it's not great here either. Speaking of stage 2, we don't have any tanks to destroy or even watchtowers to blow up. The colours themselves are obviously better, providing more detail and clarity, but the inconsistent scrolling in sprites, which are actually moving fairly quick here, does it the most damage. It's not really a fun game to play, but it is a step up from the ZX Spectrum conversion, but by no means though is this Commodore 64 game good. Magazines on its release wasn't particularly kind with this either. Commodore Format issue 35 from 1993 gave its Kicks re-release a measly 28%, while Zap 64 issue 76 from 1991 gave its original release a rating of 59%. You might look at the major frame drops in this Amstrad CPC release and think it looks fairly unplayable, but compared to a Commodore 64's version, this is actually much better. At least here we don't have a scrolling screen which has a mind of its own. It's very obvious that this version is a coloured version of the Spectrum's game, although the ZX Spectrum's version scrolled better. The nice part of this Amstrad release is opening introduction screens. It's all very nicely drawn out here and it looks good in colour too. It's not perfect at all though, but resembles the arcades game much better than the previous two games in this video. It has been said this Amstrad's release isn't really playable, and I can agree with that to some extent, but to be fair, all three of these 8-bit computer versions are fairly bad in their own right. I actually thought the music and sound effects was better here too, and the flashing screen for releasing bombs looks really cool, and the explosion sounds also sound good too. Oddly enough, we don't get to see grenades being thrown, or it could be blind, I'm not sure there. Either way, not a brilliant version by any means, but probably the best version of the 8-bit computer ports. Next up, we have the Atari ST conversion. Now, this looks fantastic in most aspects for an ST game. Pick-up items such as power-ups and so forth are nicely detailed here, and we also get the true arcade look with its vertical styled center presentation. We even get in-game music with sound effects at the same time. There is no denying everything's really here. We also got a two-player option to play simultaneously. The Atari ST version has one major flaw though. The slow pace of this game totally destroys it in every way. We also have lives in this version, and so when we die we have a chance to continue, unlike the next version in this video. The ST was sometimes underpowered for more complex games, and most certainly when far too much is happening at one time on the screen. Again, a chance for Tech to finally adjust things such as making some sacrifices to certain things, and this could have been much better than what it actually was. Controlling the game isn't the best. It kind of verges on Amstrad's issues with such low frame drops, which totally takes any form of fun away from this. It feels like you are playing it just for the sake of playing it. Just as you thought things would improve for the better, the Sega Master System's version was also developed by Tiratex. You'll notice that the box art doesn't proudly display Tiratex. In fact, it's nowhere to be seen for this European and Brazilian game. It's pretty much the Amstrad's version, only this scroll's nicer and looks a bit more detailed. I was actually baffled as to why I had a game over when I died whilst playing this game. I thought maybe there was a setting in options to increase the number of lives or even continues. Well, to my amazement, this game won't give you an option to add more lives to the game. Once you die, you die. Game over and back to the start again. I just don't understand this development team. If they added lives with this version, this could have been so much better. It seems that it's those little things that irritates players the most, where Tiratex would not actually bother with. A little like with the Commodore 64 release, if Tiratex just improved the scrolling, things could have been much better. I just really don't get it. Apart from the lack of lives here, I thought there could be an introduction here where the helicopter drops the Mercs into the stage. Nope, like I say, just a version of the Amstrad's game, so it seems, with some improvements made. Sega Power magazine rated this release at the time with a 70%, which it also complained about no lives within this version. There is no in-game music, this only appears at boss fights, just sound effects throughout which sound awful. When moving around, it kind of sounds like your player is walking on a tin roof rather than walking on muddy ground. Now, talking about movement, this game does struggle to keep a consistent frame rate when too much is happening. It kind of feels like the Master System is breathing for air at certain points. This one released in 1991 and Sega released it, definitely not one of Sega's finest moments, and it doesn't even feature a two-player option. Truth be told, I was expecting the Amiga's conversion to be superior to the Atari ST version. Reason being is that the Amiga, technically speaking, handles scrolling sprites much better. The Amiga also had more colours than the Atari ST. I am convinced that the Atari ST version and this version are virtually the same in terms of colours used. They look so close, it's almost like Tiratex used the same game on Amiga or vice versa. Now, the stupid thing here is that because of Amiga's larger colour palette in handling of scrolling, you might think that this would look and scroll better. Firstly, the Amiga's ability to make games look better hasn't or doesn't appear to have been considered here. For an Amiga game and of this version's release, it doesn't particularly look like a premium game. In fact, for an Amiga game, it looks terrible. What's even more shocking with this release is that explosions when blowing up huts or bosses look so pixelated and just terrible. Even these elements look the same as the ST's version in that respect. In terms of scrolling controls, this is the only real notable difference here. Although it does struggle to keep up a steady frame rate, it is much faster and more responsive than the ST's offering. Music and sound effects here aren't particularly wonderful either. It's below an average shooter for the Commodore Amiga. There is also a bug with this version, so once all your lives are gone, the game screen shows a continue countdown, even though we can't actually continue at this point. Amiga Format issue 25 from 1991 rated this conversion with a 72%, indicating at the time that it was a mediocre game, nothing special. It likely comes to no surprise for those who know these arcade home conversions of Mercs that the Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis game is vastly superior, and likely one of the best games on the platform too. One major flaw with this version though is that you might expect a two-player option. Well, don't expect it with this Sega version because it wasn't implemented here. Now let me tell you, Tiratex had no involvement with this game, and so this game for that reason is very good. This is the version that I personally played with my own Sega Mega Drive back in the day, and by far it's the best version for many reasons. I am pretty sure I don't even need to say much because just looking at the colours, the fluid scrolling and everything else beats anything that Tiratex ever developed. The game is simply as close to the arcade game as you could get at the time when this was released. This Mega Drive game even contains two modes of play, the arcade game itself and its own original mode, which changes the game entirely with new layouts and offers us a much more challenging game to play. We have a main options menu here where we can choose between difficulty levels. Now, the music and sound effects here are really the cherry on the cake. Again, the closest you would have gotten to playing this at home outside of the arcade. It's a fairly faithful conversion, which even provides that arcade look with the vertical style. Sure, it's not centralized, but it works well here. We even have some parallax scrolling here too as we walk towards the boss on the first stage. The background moves independently from the main gameplay area. I won't say it is a completely flawless game, as there is occasional frame drops, and I did actually notice this going through stage 2. The Jeep is also nice to control here, and blowing up buildings and tanks look pretty spectacular. And that's it for today's ranking every home conversion of Mercs. Did you agree with the top spot? I actually think it's a no-brainer here. The Mega Drive, hands down, wiped the floor with everything here, and for good reason. Terratech's, their games were just shocking. Now, if you're actually interested in Terratech's games, I'm currently in the process of editing a new Terratech's video, which you might want to check out, so make sure to hit notifications for that. But anyways, drop us a comment in the comment section and let us know which version you was unfortunate to have back in the day. Anyways, until next video comes, thanks for watching.